So just a kind of a show of hands, how many of you have been a part of a data breach? A couple? How many of you would not like to be part of a data breach? Hopefully all of you. How many of you work with applications or systems that deal with consumer data that would require you to do that? Okay, a good number. So I have to put a few disclaimers here. The perspectives presented are my own and not that of my employer, which is Under Armour. It's in the press, so Under Armour did have a data breach the early part of this year in our MyFitnessPal application, and that's out there. I can't talk about that specifically, so we still have litigation pending and so forth. So all of the opinions here are a combination. I've had other experience in data breach response prior to being at Under Armour, and so this is a culmination of all of those experiences that I've had in how that drove some learnings that I wanted to share with the community in the process. So a little bit about me. So Karen mentioned a few of those things, and I didn't want to put like a logo sheet of like where I've worked, but I wanted to talk a little bit about my story and how that's relevant in this conversation. So I started out as a programmer when I was a ripe 10 years old, and started with that, was a developer for a number of years, and then during that time, security was just a hobby, right? From the time I got my first MDEF virus on my Mac when I was growing up, it was just sort of an interesting hobby. It wasn't a profession until later in my career when I was doing software development on a project to identify anomalies in network traffic that I'd sort of learned about this entire domain of InfoSec as a profession. And so I made that transition, went into InfoSec, into red teaming when I was at Sandia National Labs, and brought all of my software development experience with me. And then it turned out all of the people at InfoSec wanted to attack software and didn't know how because they came from a network background. So I brought in those skills, learned a ton about that, and then when I came sort of out of that into the next phase of my career, I started in AppSec when I was at Fortify doing professional services for teams. And that's where I had a lot of exposure to customers that had gone through data breaches or in various stages of their data breach actions. And at that time, the laws were not the laws that we have today, and so they didn't have to publicly disclose all of their activities, but there were still things that I learned from their processes and how they were handling their security incidents in that realm. And I brought all that with me, and now I'm at Under Armour working on the security for our digital fitness apps and our fitness community for all of our users. So that's where I brought this in, and I wanted to make sure I talked a little bit about that, but it's that breadth of experience and working with all of those different folks that made it possible. So why this talk? And one of the reasons that I gave this in the first time that I was exposed to a customer that I worked with that had a breach and had an incident, there was all these new facets that I learned just being as part of their response team after the incident. And then through the process over the years, I've learned so many more. And as I've talked to others in the community, they weren't aware of all of the different facets. And one of the top questions that I've had from people when I've presented or talked or just networked in the industry since the Under Armour data breach has been, how did you guys do it? Right? How did things happen? How did you respond so quickly? And so I wanted to share a lot of these things because I think a lot of the community doesn't understand the nature of all the different facets of things that you have to respond to in these situations. Another driver for this was what I saw in the industry as a deficiency in terms of how we approach this. This is definitely improvement. So in 2015, the average days to disclose was around 82 days. I mean, almost 3 months, like close to two and 3/4 months. And some of these are much longer, right? That also skews. You have breaches like Yahoo, where it was almost 2 years before they actually disclosed something that happened. And we still have even the most recent Facebook breach. That was, I think, on the neighborhood of 45 to 50 days before they disclosed. So this is something that needs to get better. Just even for me as a consumer, I want to see that be better. I want to know if my data has been compromised by somebody that I do business with. And I want to know much sooner than average. And that was, in talking to people, I was at RSA about, not quite a month, about 3 weeks after our breach. And every question I got was like, how did you guys do it in 4 days? And what was that like, and how did you build to that? And so I wanted to share a little bit of it. Not every detail in this is from us. It's a lot of aggregate learnings, and I can't get into all the details, again, because we still have some active litigation. So what happens, right? Day zero for you, and for me personally, I had just gotten home from a hockey game and checked my email and had that moment of like, uh-oh, what are we going to do now? And so there's a whole slew of emotions that you're going to go through at that point in time. When you realize that someone else may have access to your data, or you find someone in your systems, you're going to have this moment. Okay, well, now what? Now what do we do? And so you have to kind of get over that. And the reason I put that is, with the quotes in there, is what word do you use at that point? And for me, that early in my career, I was like, oh, we've been breached. Well, that's probably not the word you want to use. I want to transition for that. And this is something that I learned from various, both people in the security community that I worked with and other consultants, as well as partners and lawyers. The word breach carries significant legal and regulatory meaning. And it ties to state and country laws, right? And things like GDPR, but also California, Singapore, Korea, like all of these countries have very specific, Australia, have very specific laws and requirements when a company has been breached with that word. And that means a certain thing in a legal context, but it also then dictates the types of responses that you must take thereafter. And so not everything, right? Not every single time you find something in your systems or you find a security bug, is it a breach? And so the lesson that I've learned from that is that, and there's also various types of records retention. Like the moment you say we have a breach, you have to start documenting at a certain level in order to support all the regulatory inquiries that are going to happen. And they might not happen for 30 or 60 days, but you've got to have that information to be able to support that. And if you ever get into lawsuit, you've got to have that. And so one of the rules of thumb that I use is, I don't say breach, I'm saying that in this talk, but in terms of the context of something happening in our infrastructure or enterprise, I never say breach, right? That's reserved for the lawyers that we work with, and that's a combination of internal counsel or outside counsel. They're the ones who make that determination of, is this a breach worthy, is this a breach event? And then when that happens, and that triggers a whole slate of other activities. Until that point in time, right, you could call it an issue, you could call it an incident, you could call it activity, but it's worthwhile to do that, and especially as you're documenting this, right, and you're communicating about it, whether it's in instant messenger, email, Slack, right, conversations that will have records, you want to make sure that you're using the right language. So kind of coming back to this, right, you've been attacked, right, or you've been, you've had an incident. This is a good way to kind of frame it. So the first reaction is that shock. The second reaction is a little bit of prayer and preparation for what's going to come next. And then you've got an instant to-do list. Now, this is the to-do list that I've come up with, but not all of these are things. These are all pieces that I learned over the years and put together. What's interesting about this list overall, and I'll go through some of them, but if we start as security practitioners and also as engineers or computer scientists, our minds are drawn to the technical. And the technical facets of this are, the incident response, the forensics, right? Some of the engineering of like fixing the defects. But that's a very small portion of all of the different set of activities that you're going to have to take on. And so as an engineer, as a security person, it's important to kind of step back from that and not make that the only priority, because it's instinct, right? If you're wired that way, if you're an engineer, it's instinct when you're in that mode of, oh my God, what do we need to do? Or what's next? It's instinct to go into the technical, to drive and dive in deeper, and not necessarily step back and look at the wider picture. So, and this happens even at the kind of the first thing you're going to do is to assess the impact, right? What's the scope? How many users are affected? What's the impact to them in terms of the information that was exposed or taken? And how do you quantify that, right? What are the probabilities of things happening? What can be used with that information? And that's completely different if it's social security numbers versus passwords versus driver's license information or country ID information and so forth. So all of that is going to factor in, but it's not the technical aspects of assessing the impact that's important necessarily. It's the wider real life impact that is going to be important to think about. And you don't want to do that in a bubble. You don't want to just be the security team figuring that out. You want to have product in that conversation. You want to have customer support in that conversation, your engineering teams, outside counsel. If you have a privacy counsel or a privacy officer, you want them involved, and so forth. A lot of these activities, once you know you have an incident, you're not necessarily going to engage in all of these things right away, right? The first time you find something that's amiss in your systems, you're going to start to investigate, and you may not know yet that you're going to need outside counsel. You may not know yet that you're going to need to tell your investors, if you're a public company, that something happened. But you're going to start to take the information that you're gathering to help make that decision. And eventually you may have to get to that point. So we're going to kind of go with the assumption that you have to do a lot of these things. One of the aspects of this that's really critical is that so many of these groups that you're connecting to are not technical. Right? It's hard to find outside counsel that's technical, that understands a microservice or a hash algorithm. Right? That's a difficult order. And so you can't just open a phone book and find outside counsel that can understand the nature of your data and your relationship with your users. So that's something that you have to do in advance. And so that's the kind of the transition to me is, it's not day zero that matters, it's actually today, right? It's minus infinity because you don't know when you're going to get breached. But the steps that you can take today to prepare are the things that are actually going to make that possible. So if we go back to this kind of core list, right? How many of you today have a privacy officer? A few. How many of you, as security practitioners or developers, how many of you know your privacy officer and have a relationship with them? A couple. What about your outside counsel? One or two? Right? Your legal team? All right, that's better. Your investor relations? Right? The PR, right? Communications? So those are the relationships that you have to have in order to mobilize those teams if necessary. Right? When it comes to that point, you have to have that. And you're not going to build that relationship under fire. You have to have that relationship in advance. And so, for those of you who don't know those folks in your enterprise, like you've got now until, hopefully it never comes, but you've got now until you have an event to build that relationship. Right? You don't have a clock. The worst thing to have to do is to have something come around, and then you have to build that relationship in a matter of hours. Right? That's a lot harder to build a relationship with a team that doesn't understand your domain. You don't understand theirs. And so that's critical to have that. How many of you have cyber insurance that you know of? A couple. How many of you know what that covers and what that doesn't cover? Right? So even if you have it, right, and I think just one or two of you knew what it covers, you don't know what that's going to be. And if you think about that activity, and cyber insurance works a lot of ways. If you've ever had hail damage or some damage to your house or something of that nature, the insurance covers restoring, right? And those cover those services. They don't cover your time. Right? So if you have to spend days and hours of work to get your roof repaired or get flood damage repaired, like they'll pay for the services that you contract to, but they don't pay for your time. And the same thing is true with cyber insurance. Like the time you invest in organizing and executing all of this, they're not necessarily going to pay for, but they will pay for your outside counsel fees. If you have to get an external forensics team to come in, an external blue team or red team, they'll pay for those kinds of things. But you've got to have tracking, right? So you got to know and be able to account for all of that and have those bills and invoices in order to collect on the insurance. And most companies have a pretty high deductible for that cyber insurance. So if your bills don't get to the point of your deductible, well, you're just going to eat the cost, and your insurance isn't even affected by it. So there's a lot of those factors that you can learn about today. Learn about what's covered. Learn about what's included or not. Build a relationship with your outside counsels. Build a relationship with your engineering teams. Have ready and available the contracts that you have for all your vendors. So give or take, how many people, what does it take in your company to sign a new vendor? What are the steps you have to do?
Vendor due diligence.
Due diligence.
Also has to go through legal for contracts.
Usually a legal review of an MSA or a license agreement of some type, right, or a services agreement. Some sort of statement of work, right, that you may have to do. You've got to have finance connections between the companies, right? So all of that stuff, doing that under the gun, that's difficult, right? And when it's not crunch time, that can take weeks. Those of you that are on the vendor side or have worked with vendors, sometimes it can take you, 6 to 8 weeks just to do all of those diligence things, even after you've agreed to terms, you've agreed to a price to buy a service or to buy some software. It can still take 6 to 8 weeks to get that approved and to actually get that executed. Trying to do that under the gun after you're now panicked and trying to figure out what's happening, if you have to bring in an incident response firm or a forensics firm, and it's taking you 6 to 8 weeks to do those contracts, right? How effective are you going to be, right? How stale is that information and their access to those systems? So that's a huge step, right? You can start to do today to build a relationship with those vendors that you might want to use. Have those contract vehicles so that if the time comes, all you have to do is a quick, PO or a quick statement of work, and then just approve it and sign it, and then they can start working, right? Getting them access to your systems. So, if you're on-prem or even if you're in the cloud, you're going to want your forensics firm or your IR firm to have access to the place that was compromised or the place that was affected. And so you've got to be able to provision that quickly. Do you know how to do that? Do they know? Can they onboard it? What's your method of secure communications to that team going to be? What's your method of communication going to be to all of these folks? So all of these aspects are things that you can invest in today. And another one that is kind of, I suppose, it's obvious, but it wouldn't necessarily be obvious unless you'd gone through it. So in my case, and this is I can share this. It's more of a personal story. When we realized that someone else might have our data, and during that event, my wife at that time was 7.5 months pregnant. And those of you who've had babies or had a spouse that's been pregnant, not always the same level of logic applies to the things that are happening in your family life during that time. But during that period, as soon as things happened, like there was an understanding. It was unwritten. It was unspoken of. But like I was like, I have to go to work, and this is like a Sunday afternoon. Like I have to go to work, and then I didn't. I think the rest of that week I slept maybe like 16 hours, and I think I was home for like 20 of that. Meanwhile, she's 7.5 months pregnant, and not particularly happy about it, but understanding because she knows the industry that I'm in and the types of things that can happen. And that's the kind of conversation you want to have before something happens, so that you can focus on what you have to do that. This is sort of a funny story. How many of you have conference room challenges in your office, like where people have bookings or they take rooms, and so when something like this happens, you need a place. How do you get a conference room on an hour notice to create a war room? Right? How easy is that to happen in your company? And like, what are the rules of engagement for that? That's difficult. And so, that during some of that time, like, and then also, what do you tell to people that aren't involved? Right? So when something happens like this, it's not public in your company. So it's not public everywhere until you decide to actually launch, but it's not even public in your company. And so only people that are read into the incident response are going to be involved. Well, you might have had meetings already set up with people that aren't involved and that aren't going to be involved, right? But now you've just canceled all your meetings. What do you tell them? What's your story going to be, right? What's the cover that you're going to use? Oh no, I'm not available anymore. Like sorry, I can't make that meeting in 5 minutes. Like, think about what that story is going to be and how you code that and how you can plan for it. And also just the social rules in your office of like, oh, I'm overstaying my welcome in a conference room. Well, sometimes like, sorry, go get another room, and you just have to understand. So, that's one thing I remember was having to kind of apologize later to some people where I've like, sorry, I took your room. Now you understand why, because but beforehand, you just can't take it. You just have to take the room. So with that, you're gonna start following the trail of what's happening, right? So when something happens, you're gonna start playing Clue and start to figure out what happened, what's the impact, who did what, who has access to what are all the things that we have to fix. Right? What are the other implications of this? And so there's so much of this going on, but there's also the same process going on with all of those other groups, right? Your PR folks are trying to figure out, well, how do we communicate this, right? How do we want to frame the messaging on the wire? Who's going to be the executive that signs the notice, right? And who's that going to be? Is it the CEO? Is it the CTO? Like, who's going to be on the hook? Like, who could get fired? Right? And all of these things are kind of unraveling in this larger activity that's happening. So it's not just you kind of like going through the wormhole of what happened, but it's also all of these other folks figuring out, how do we frame what happened? How do we talk about it to the regulators? How do we talk about it? What does this mean with respect to our user base? What are our obligations under the law? And in a lot of cases, you're still figuring that out, right? Even those folks, your counsel, your outside counsel, are playing Clue themselves because they're saying, okay, well, this is what happened, or here's what you're telling me happened. Now I got to go check, the German privacy law and see what that entails. I got to go check the South Korean privacy law and see what that entails. I got to go check the Singapore law and see what that entails, the Australian law, and piece all that together. So they're doing that as well, all in parallel. And so there's a lot of different activity, and there's no way, even if you're a leader in the response team, there's so much happening at once that you can't corral it all. But you've got to have the trust and the communication and relationships and collaboration with all of those different people in order to let them execute and let them go figure those things out for you, and to really be a team. And so the collaboration and the communication of this, it just, even like thinking back, it can't be, overstated how important this is. So onboarding, like how do you bring someone into a breach response, right? Or into an incident response? What do you tell them? What's the background, right? What do they need to know up front? And you've got to, have that communication. But also part of that onboarding is what are their rules of engagement? Who are they allowed to talk to, right? Who is on the roster of people they can talk to openly about what's happening because they're already read in, versus what can they say to somebody who's not read in, but who they need information from, right? So if you got to go talk to an engineer about how does this function or this service work, but you're not reading them in, so you can't tell them all of what's happening, but you just got to be able to go and have that conversation. Like what's that story for how you're going to have that conversation? And so, having that trust, having that communication, what tools are they going to use? Is this all going to be via email, right? Is instant messenger okay? Is text message okay? Right? Is Slack okay, or Jabber, or whatever else you end up using in your collaboration tool workspace? Are you if you're not all in one office, right? Are you using, what kind of virtual meeting rooms are you using? Is it WebEx? Is it, what sort of places are you going to put files, right? Is it going to be, Dropbox or Google Drive or OneDrive? Like what's allowed and what's not allowed? And how do you, in all of those places, in all the notes that you record, handwritten or digital, where's that going to be? Are the people on the team, like let's say somebody on the response team is a diligent Evernote user? Do you want these notes in their Evernote cloud account, right? Which is not a company connected account. But you've got to have some of that, all of those rules of engagement. And those are things that you can invest in today, thinking through how you think that might work. And you might not get it all right. You may not have a plan that's 100%, but you're going to have, if you have a plan at all, if you have some basic guidelines at all, that's going to be way better for you in terms of when things are happening than if you had to come up with it on the fly. And then for all of that, how do you maintain legal privilege? How many of you understand what legal privilege is?
No idea.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So thank you for being honest. So legal privilege, it's that attorney-client relationship, right? And so as you hear, right, like in other stories, like you have the privilege, and you have privilege with your attorney to be honest and frank with them, and they can't disclose everything, so you have privacy in that relationship. And so even in a business environment, the company can have legal privilege with their counsel, which means you can be transparent with that counsel, and the communication that you have with that counsel, all of the details you send them, are not subject to subpoena and discovery if you get into a later route. So it's protected, right? That communication, that deliberation and thought process, right? As you're talking through the impact, as you're talking through what are our options of what path we might take, you want those discussions to be underprivileged so that they're protected from your creditors, from your insurance potentially, from regulators, so that you have a trust area, essentially, and a trust boundary around your workspace. And that's what legal privilege provides you. But in order to do that, you've got to have your counsel, and typically it's an outside counsel. Sometimes you can have legal privilege with an inside counsel, but usually it's an outside counsel. And so that means your outside counsel has to be involved in those communications. So, a common way is, in order to have confidentiality and privilege in an email discussion, you mark the emails as privileged and confidential, and your outside counsel is CC'd on those messages. Well, how do you maintain that in a chat room? That means the outside counsel has to be in your chat rooms, right? That you're having these discussions in order to have that, and that chat room has to be marked as attorney-client privileged and confidential. And so you've got to have that apparatus to do that. And if you're a shop that uses collaboration tools like that on a healthy basis, which is great. I mean, I love Slack, and we use Slack at LASCON. Right? The organizing team uses Slack at LASCON to organize things together, and it's super productive. But that means you've got to have an outside counsel that is capable of being in Slack, right? So you have lawyers that are savvy enough to use Slack, right? If that's your choice, if it's Jabber or something else, and you have to have lawyers that are willing to do that via text message, right? If you want to have text message threads with them. So these are things that you can invest in today, like figure out how your teams work and how they're most productive in terms of collaborating under fire. And a good way to even do this into practice is your regular incident response process, right? For outages or uptime or availability, like look at that process and look at how they collaborate and how it works. And then, imagine, okay, well, let's say we needed to do all of this under privilege. How do we do it, right? Where would we need outside counsel to be present in these conversations? How do we engage an outside counsel to be present in all of these different discussions? Right? And you can game plan that and kind of table talk it. And then you have a plan of like, okay, when we go to sign an outside counsel and find them and retain them, we want these requirements. You must be able to use these tools in order to collaborate with us the way we need to in order to be productive in our incident response. So that's really, it's an important challenge, and I think it's something that we just take for granted. And it's easy to take those communication tools for granted, but when you're presented with an environment where you have to use them in a certain way, that makes things really tough. And I can say that without good collaboration and communication tools, there's no way that any organization could respond to an incident in a rapid manner. If you have to send emails and your email response time in your company or with outside counsel is 24 hours. I mean, every single step that you take is 24 hours lag time. And so it makes sense that organizations take months to figure things out because they're not collaborating very quickly. And they don't, they have to go through all of these things in a slow manner. But these are things that you can invest in today that will make that significantly faster and better. So we talked a little bit about some of the stuff you can do in advance. And once an incident happens, all of those different things, all those different wheels are turning. There's a point in your cycle where from the time you have an incident and you're investigating and you're mobilizing all these different teams, you're collaborating, you've got privilege, you're figuring out what do we need to do. Right? At some point, you're going to have a decision day when you're going to decide, is this a disclosable event? Is this really a breach? Right? Is this something that we're going to have to take to the public? We're going to have to issue press releases about or tell our investors. And so once that decision is made, and that's a huge day, right? That's going to involve your leadership team, your executives, all of your counsel, all the people that we've been talking about. And then you make a decision of like, we're going to go and we're going to announce this. And so, kind of tying to, and I thought it was a great message this morning from Jason's talk, that starts top down, right? Your executives have to be on board and ready to do that. And I think that's such a critical step in the process is they have to understand what that means. They have to understand what it means to have that and to make this decision and to know what questions to ask. And so this is also an area where you can prepare because you can do, an exercise, right? Like you can do a table talk or a tabletop kind of exercise with your leadership team, with all the people that you would think need to be in the room for this kind of decision, right? Your head of PR, your head of marketing, your head of investor relations, your CTO, your CEO, whoever those people are, right? This decision process, doing it under fire is hard, no question. But this is also a process that you can practice. And that's important and it's worthwhile to invest in practicing with your leaders. Right? How would we go about making decisions? Let's assume we had an event. Who are the people that we would need to notify? And let all of those leaders come to that tabletop exercise and figure that out, right? And actually have that and game plan it. Because if you can do that once, and it's going to be messy and miserable, and they're going to be scared afterwards, but what'll happen is when it happens for real, they won't be as scared because you've practiced it, right? They have an idea of what questions to ask. They have an idea of what's going to happen. They have an idea of who's going to own what, right? And what are the responsibilities for all the different people involved. So then you're going to prepare a communications plan. You're going to get that together. That's also going to be vetted by outside counsel. Also your remediation plan of anything you need to fix, or a long, and you'll have a long list of things that you want to fix afterwards that, as you unwound all of the threads of your incident, you're going to say, oh yeah, we should have fixed this. We need to do this. We need to improve this system and improve this system. We're going to add a defense here and add a control there and so forth. So you're going to have a long list of all of that. And all of that will be things that you're going to get, sign off on as part of your incident response. And all of the outside counsel, all the review, all of that will be presented. Another big facet of the communication plan is, what will you tell your users? Right? What are you going to tell people about the incident? What do they need to know? How do they need to act and respond? What steps do individual users need to take? What detail can you tell them about what happened, or who is attacking you, and so forth? All of that's something that you have to discuss and have a plan. Where will users go to get help? Right? Where will they go to ask questions? Right? We have a fax somewhere that's going to be available, and what will that look like? And so you got to have all of that together and piece that together. And then the day it happens, you're gonna, you'll have all of that stuff in place, and you'll publish, and then you're going to kind of wait and see how quickly the press picks things up, and from the time the release happens to where it goes, and some of that's going to depend on the size and nature of your company. And if you're a high-profile company, it'll happen pretty quickly. If you're not a high-profile company, maybe no one will even report it. Maybe, right? You never know. So it all varies. But some of the things that will continue to happen there is you're going to need continuing collaboration, because you're going to have, if it does get picked up, you're going to have media calling in or emailing or contacting you and saying, asking for more details, asking for additional information. So you want to funnel them to the right people, right? To the PR folks that know how to handle that kind of response. But then when they receive questions that they need more help for, you want those people to be empowered to say, hey, I need help answering this question. And your outside counsel is going to have to approve every single answer, right? As well as your inside counsel. And you want to have a technical person that's involved to make sure that the message is technically correct when it goes out, and so forth. But it's also usable. And you also want to make sure your customer support people are involved in that process. And so you need to have an ability to continue to react and correct and update information. But another piece that's there is you also can't control everything. People will misprint what happened, right? Despite whatever facts you have in your press release and in your public announcements, it will get reported somewhere that it was different, or that it was more users or less users that were affected, and you can't fix it all. Right? And there's gonna be times when you're like, oh man, this is so wrong, and you're like, is it really worth our time to go and correct that? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. How many people listened to that program or saw that news piece? What's the profile of that news network? Is it worth our time to go and correct that inaccuracy in what they reported, or is it better to just move on and let the next story kind of dominate what happens? Those are calls that you have to make, and you can't always have truth, right? Sometimes there's just going to be those misstatements that are out there. And it's interesting, even today, this is months after our breach, I still, every now and then something will come up and somebody will mention the Under Armour story, and they'll put a fact about it, in one sentence, oh, this happened to Under Armour earlier this year, and it's this. And often it'll be wrong. I'm like, well, it's too late. We're not really going to go and correct all this, but people will make up those narratives, and you can't control it all. And that was a hard thing for me to grapple with, right? I'm an engineer. I want truth, I want accuracy, and I want precision, and that's that's not always going to be there. And it's okay, because in the end, it doesn't necessarily hurt you. It just depends on what happens, and as long as you've done the right things for your users and for your teammates through that, then you're going to be fine.
So what does your legal team say about that? It's like, we're not liable because our press release is correct. They'll be liable for
Well,
using incorrect material, so we're not gonna deal with them. We just stick with the press release? I mean, how did they tell you in general? with
so
that?
in general,
It's like, how do you manage that? You can't manage all of them, you said.
you can't manage all of them,
So what does
right?
the legal department say? As long as our press releases are correct?
I mean, you're always going to make sure the information you put out there is 100% correct. How people quote it is a lot harder to control. And how people use that information is a lot harder to control. And I think you have to it's really case by case. You have to look at who's doing the publishing, what the context is, and then is the impact of correcting them better or worse than doing nothing, right? You're always going to make sure that what you've published is accurate and up to date and honest and straightforward, right? And that's what you want. But the other piece is where people misquote it or misreference it. It's a kind of a risk management challenge of like, how much is it worth it? What effort is it going to take us to correct this for them to republish it or to do a correction? And is them republishing worse than doing nothing?
But would your legal team say, well, we don't have to defend their statement, we don't have to defend our statement?
That's right.
Basically, that's the bottom line.
That's the bottom line, yeah.
And
in terms of most of the regulators, that's what they're going to say. Like the regulators themselves, in various conversations that we've had with regulators, even in non-breach situations, is they look at your statements. A big part of like GDPR and the other things is they're not necessarily looking for what other people say about what your activities are. Even with what Facebook does or whatnot, they're looking at what's in your privacy policy. Right? What have you written down that you said you're committing that you will do, and then that's what they're going to hold you accountable for. And so as long as that is true and correct, and you can stand behind those words, that's what the regulators have the authority to hold you accountable for.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So after that point in time, after you have disclosed and you have all of this, you still have a lot of work to do. So going forward, and depending on what the nature of the issue is, that could go for a long time. And so you're going to have more remediation. You may still have additional evidence collection and retention. Typically, red team and an incident response is still longer than the time you actually disclose, right? You may still continue. You may still be figuring out, more about that. If you had a situation where, it is something that happened and you do have law enforcement involved, right? Legal investigations from a criminal perspective take years sometimes. And so that could go on. And so you're going to be providing that evidence and holding and storing it and providing it to law enforcement and to investigators for some period of time. So you want to have the ability to retain that and present it. Also for the regulators, they may also ask for things. One thing that was surprising to me is that most of the regulators actually don't want any evidence. Like, they don't want a lot of technical details. What they're looking for is, how you are responding, and are you responding within your requirements of the law, right? Did you respond the way the law said you should have? Did you provide the right information to your users in a timely manner? And then what are you doing afterwards to prevent and fix this? So it was interesting, like the level, and I think hindsight's 2020, like looking back, like most of those regulators don't have technical people, right, on their teams. They don't have a lot of depth in, modern software stacks and services, so that they don't necessarily even know what to ask for. In some cases, occasionally you get one that does, and usually okay, they have somebody pretty sharp on their team. But a lot of them don't, and so they're going off of the legal documents that you provide, right? What was in your published statements, what's in your privacy policy, and then how are you complying with the laws in their jurisdiction. If you have litigation, you have things like discovery that may come up, and a process. A lot of the cases that happen do get settled. The majority of those cases that happen after a breach get settled in some way. And so you just saw, I think yesterday or the day before, Yahoo reached a settlement off of their breach. where they're going to pay a certain amount of money and provide credit monitoring services to people. So that's part of the process, and that takes a while to kind of go through, and that may take months to a year. I was one of the reasons I have the disclaimers in the beginning was I was hoping that most of our cases, the majority of the litigation that was put up against Under Armour has been settled, but there's still some active ones going. So that's something that goes on. There's customer communication and response, and this one is super critical, and this will continue well after after you announce and longer after that. Kind of the one of the funniest pieces of that to me it was just eye-opening was some of the rage that individual people have, and I get it from a consumer perspective, but some of the rage that people have is also just kind of crazy. Like there were some people that wrote to us and wrote to our customer support and filed tickets and were super upset with Under Armour that we didn't tell them. Like, I found out on the news that this happened, and I didn't find out from you directly. Now, we sent out, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of over 100 million emails. You can't send 100 million emails in an hour. Like, it doesn't happen, right? And so even though, yes, we were sending, the minute we had our press releases, we were sending emails to customers. But if you were towards the middle or bottom of that list, like, it was a day or two before you could get those emails, because there isn't a service around that can blast out that many emails and not flag you as a spammer and get all those emails blocked. And so, we have to go through and we're using top tier providers to send those, but there's no way that it's going to happen in less time than it is to get reported in the news. And so it was funny that people were so irate about, I didn't get the email until a day or two later. It's like, sorry. Like, so all of those things are there. There's a few other pieces that are there. You want to gather lessons learned, figure out what you want to improve about the incident process, prepare for the next issue, and then also, recharge, because you're going to have been running on adrenaline for, days or weeks at a time, and you want to do that, but all of the team is going to be as well. And that's another piece that has to be a part of this is you've got to go back and kind of thank your team and be humble for all of the effort that everyone else has put into the incident response, not just on you, but all of those other folks. So, we had customer support people that were, working, 12, 18-hour days to respond to our users afterwards, and that, those are heroic things that people are doing in dealing with the kind of the irate messages that come in on a frequent basis. So all of that is, hopefully those are some lessons in there that you can learn from, and happy to take questions, and feel free to come talk to me afterwards or around.